Hey guys, hello from my backyard. I am trying really hard to find the time to make these videos. It's kind of hard right now because I'm like homeschooling my kids. Sorry, I'm moving the camera. I'm trying to get comfy on my backyard couch here. So I know this is a weird time and we're going to try our best here, but considering the fact that the AP exam is saying that it's going to end with imperialism, basically, which was what we were supposed to be finishing last week. Um, I'm going to do two final lectures for now on chapter 24, which is the Age of Anxiety, Modernity, and Imperialism. And then after that, I'm going to put up some other stuff. I'd like for you guys to continue your learning. Next year, you're going to need it anyway, right? I mean, you are going to be in U.S. history if you are sophomores, and you're going to want to know about things like World War One and World War Two and the Cold War, the Holocaust, all of these things that happened in the 20th and 21st centuries that unfortunately have been ripped away this year. So I would like for you to continue your learning. I'm going to support your learning, but I'm going to be making a couple of videos. Well, I'm going to try to make them today. It's kind of hard, I'm like homeschooling my kids and they are needy, let me tell you, and fractions are no fun. So anyway, guys, today you might need to go onto the website, and this is my chapter 24 site, and I want you to take a look at the packet. So you're going to go down here and you're going to download the chapter 24 reading packet, because it has a reading on in there that I would like for you guys to do just for your own. I want you to be able to recognize it. It's Jacques' letter by Emile Zola regarding the Dreyfus Affair, which we're going to talk about. So, with that being said, hopefully you guys will join me for our Zoom conference tomorrow. With that being said, though, I kind of want to just get on with this lecture that we're going to be talking about today. So, I'm going back to my old PowerPoints, and I really thought about trying to jazz these up a little bit. I know that they're not super exciting, but the truth is, I'm not good at this. So, I'm hoping you guys will just be patient with me, and maybe this will feel like a little bit more comfortable for you guys. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. Okay, today we're going to talk about, first of all, the women's suffrage movement in England. This is one of the things that is transforming democracy. And after all, during the Age of Anxiety, democracy was transforming. It was becoming something very different that Europe had never really experienced before. We're also going to talk about what Jewish life was like in Europe. In the late 1800s, Jews were becoming much more mainstreamed into society, and that is met with different reactions, most of them very bad. As we're gearing our way into the Holocaust, it's important to recognize that that hatred didn't come from nowhere, it didn't come from thin air. This anti-Semitism had been building. So we're going to particularly look at the pogroms of Eastern Europe, especially in Russia. And then, of course, the big scandal, which was the Dreyfus Affair in France, which nearly ripped apart the Third Republic, which was brand new at the time. We're going to look at Britain and Italy in particular. So the reason why there's so much transformation going on is because liberalism itself is transitioning into something new. And it starts to resemble a lot more of what we think of as liberalism today. So, don't forget, liberals used to be, much more revolutionary. They also believed in laissez-faire economics, which laissez-faire capitalism actually was something that really helped hurt the poor. Not helped, it really hurt the poor. It actually, in many ways, contributed to new elements of poverty that hadn't existed before. Not that poverty was new, that's not what I'm saying, but this was a different kind of poverty. It was like sort of an urban industrial poverty. Liberals take a cue from the real politics, conservatives, and they start to actually care about the misery of the poor. And then we're going to look at change and tension in Germany. Otto von Bismarck gets fired by Willy, the emperor of Germany, of the new empire. Also, Germany is becoming an empire. That means they're going to take some colonies, and this causes some tension, along with nationalism in Austria-Hungary. Notice I called it Austria-Hungary, not Austria. Okay. Oops, I have to hide this thing here. Sorry. And then we're going to look also at industrialism and revolution in Russia, and also the rise of the United States that's taking place at the same time. So in the United States, this is called the Gilded Age. Some might even call it the Progressive Era. There's a bit of overlap there. You'll hopefully, of course, be learning about it next year in your U.S. history class a little bit more. Okay, so let's start first with the women's suffrage movement. Um, First of all, women had gained a lot of rights in England in particular. For example, they had gained some rights with divorce, they had gained some rights with property ownership. They were starting to become involved in new professions such as secretaries and teachers, even journalism. Nursing also, provides another avenue for women to have respectable careers. So all of these great things seem to be happening for women, not everywhere, like I said, mostly in the West, including the United States to a certain extent. But the right to vote was still out of their reach. So women were starting to become a lot more demanding of the right to vote. And how they made those demands is what causes a lot of division. Some women believed that we needed to, still be ladylike and do this legally and go through the proper avenues of government. Other women said, well, we've tried that before and we get ignored and we get laughed at, so maybe it's time to take some serious action and become a little bit more radical. The most famous of these radical women was Emmeline Pankhurst. She died in 1928, but fortunately for her, she did live to see the enfranchisement of women in England. So she creates this organization called the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903. Emmeline Pankhurst, however, was known for really radical tactics that would get attention. She believed in doing things like smashing mailboxes and breaking windows, protests, and things that got people's attention. It wasn't because she was herself a violent, radical person, but she was from this sort of new school of feminism. She just believed women have tried being nice, women have tried being ladylike, and sitting down and waiting for their turn to speak, and that has gotten us nowhere. So perhaps something more drastic is required. Got to fight fire with fire. And at the same time, many women who wanted some political say in Europe also were making demands for peace. These things didn't necessarily have anything to do with voting per se, but for example, you see some women like Bertha von Suttner who are asking for things like put an end to the arms race, the amount of weapons that were being created, that were being used for imperialism, to imperial conquest and stuff like that. At the same time, some women were also starting to become much more vocal in topics that were traditionally women's areas anyway, like education. You might have heard of Montessori schools. Maria Montessori was a woman in Italy who she wanted to transform childhood education. And so she wanted, for example, a school in which children would have a little bit more freedom, a little bit more choice. And because she had already opened a school for developmentally disabled children, she was actually Italy's first female doctor as well. So she knew quite a bit about child development. We still have Montessori schools today. So this kind of gives you an idea of how important women were during this time and some of the long-lasting effects that women had on things like peace and democracy and education. Here's an example of, let's go back to this whole thing about the division between women. Some women believe, like I said, in being moderate and quiet, sort of more graceful, I guess you could say. This is Millicent Fawcett. She was a British suffragette, although she didn't call herself necessarily a suffragette. Suffragette was actually a derogatory term at first, and then later on women embraced it with pride. But she believed that women ought to be, as you guys can see in the picture here, law-abiding. She thought radicalism would actually hurt the feminist cause. And maybe to a certain extent she was right, at least for a while. After all, what really got women the right to vote was largely World War I, both in the United States and in Britain. But this is Emmeline Pankhurst and some of the other suffragettes. For example, some of them get arrested outside, protesting outside of Buckingham Palace. You can see this woman is being dragged away by her hair. These women struggling for the right to vote. Here is Emmeline Pankhurst herself being arrested outside of Buckingham Palace in 1914. You can kind of see the look on those men's faces, how like they're sort of disgusted with her because of her radical tactics. And this is the year that World War I broke out, by the way, 1914. Some women even went as far as to martyr themselves. There was an event in England. There was an Epsom Derby horse race. One of the famous suffragettes, her name was Emily Davison, and she decided that she would gain attention for the cause by literally throwing herself in front of the king's own horse at this Derby horse race that the king was riding in. The horse ran over her and killed her. But because she was holding a suffragette sign, that is what got the attention. Some people might say that she died for the cause. Was it effective? Yes. Many people began to pay attention to her as well, and to the cause overall. So don't forget, people have died for your right to vote. I was going to show you guys this movie after the test. So if you guys want to watch it, oh, here's Hi. Speaking of women, here's my daughter. She really wanted to come and say hi. Hi, Iris. Can you say hi? Hi. Hi. So this was one of the films that I wanted to show you guys after the exam. Please stop that. Stop. Okay. You guys see what I mean? This is not that easy. But anyway, I highly recommend it. It's a film about the English suffrage movement. Iris, this is not a TikTok video, but okay. Okay, moving on now. Another thing that was changing democracy, you guys know what I'm seeing, what I'm talking about? Another thing that was really changing democracy at this time was Jewish life. So at this time in Europe, the late 1800s, Jews had already started to mainstream into society. Don't forget that often because of certain segregation laws that existed in many European countries, Jews were forced to live in ghettos, and they were not really invited to be part of mainstream society. It's cold out here. I need my blanket. And that had changed ever since the Enlightenment. I'm looking at my notes here. After the Enlightenment, Jews really had started to become more part of society, and many of them even assimilated. They began to dress the same. They adopted many of the customs of secular European society. Not everyone, but a lot of them did, and many Jews left the ghetto. So many of them thrived and they did well, and they lived in nicer neighborhoods, and in some places had already become citizens, had been emancipated from the ghetto. An example of that would be, for example, in England. But anti-Semitism was an ugly thing that was especially prominent in Eastern Europe, in particular in the Austrian Empire and Germany. We see this a lot, but not coincidentally, by the way, that's where Hitler was from. He was actually from Austria. And in Austria, for example, we start to see like the fusing of anti-Semitism with nationalism and politics. For example, we start to see, for example, the mayor of Vienna, Austria himself, and the Christian Socialist Party. They actually stood for example, their agenda was about the rights of Austrian workers and Austrian veterans and German veterans and stuff like that. But they start to kind of lash out at the Jewish community. They viewed Jews as people who were imposing on their life, not real Austrians or not real Germans, or taking jobs away from Austrians and Germans. So we see this a lot. This is also repeated in the United States. We see that, not except instead of against Jewish people, we see it lashing out at African Americans after the end of slavery, who were trying to, African Americans trying to get jobs in the factories up north. So it's kind of the same deal, repeated with a twist in Europe. It's and by the way, the mayor of Vienna at the time, Karl Lueger, he used to make all kinds of anti-Semitic speeches. This was during Adolf Hitler's childhood, so this kind of shows you where he gets these ideas. Anyway, the thing about this, though, is that often many of these people believe that Judaism is not just a religion, it's a race, and it is an ethnicity. However, it is because of that it becomes race-based and not religious-based. Remember, the Enlightenment was about had tried to teach people religious toleration. But if you make it about race, then and it's no longer about a belief system, that's to be tolerated, but instead make it about race, make it about nationality. These are things that you cannot elect yourself into. That changes the game entirely. And for many people, it justified anti-Semitism. In Eastern Europe, it was especially bad. 72% of the entire world's Jewish population lived in Eastern Europe, in places like Russia and Poland. This is also gives you an idea of why Hitler was so desperate to invade those lands. So many Jews began to feel like this was not a place that they could continue to live, that many of them saw that there was no future for them, especially because of limitations on their civil rights, segregation laws, in Eastern Europe, pogroms, which are state sponsored violent attacks. So many of them start to emigrate. Some came to the United States, many went to South America as well, or Canada. But many of them started to think in more biblical terms, and this is where the Zionist movement comes from. So Zionism is based on the idea of, that comes from the Bible. Mount Zion is a place, it's a real place. In the Bible, it was the site of the ancient Jewish kingdoms of King David, and Jews had been expelled way back in biblical times by invaders, and this causes what's called the Jewish diaspora. And that meant that Jewish people became scattered throughout the world, and they were essentially a people without a state. The only thing that to tie them together was their religion, and everywhere they went, they were minorities. This explains why they were treated so badly in places, especially in Europe. So, a Jewish intellectual by the name of Theodor Herzl, he publishes a paper called The Jewish State, in which he essentially starts to call for the establishment of a Jewish state in their old biblical homeland. That was Israel. The only issue here now is that it's no longer called Israel by this point, it's Palestine, and it is populated by Arab peoples called the Palestinians. Would the Palestinians want to be displaced to make room for now a state for Jewish immigrants? Probably not. Despite that, though, a lot of Jews from Europe did emigrate and they started their own Jewish settlements in Palestine. As you guys can probably guess, this becomes a huge deal later on. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the Israeli Palestinian conflict is something that continues to this day and is a massive issue in world politics and in warfare, unfortunately. As you guys can see, because Palestine, now officially recognized as Israel, is in the Ottoman Empire as well. So it's not even in technically, what Europeans at the time considered Europe. Okay, now we'll come back to that a little bit later, but let's look at how liberalism itself is transformed. Um, Liberalism, as you guys if you guys remember from class, liberals, they were really into laissez-faire economics, things like religious toleration, constitutional governments. And while many of those elements about liberals remain true, they start to change economically. And so this is where they start to resemble what we think of as liberals today. Economically speaking, liberals today have a tendency to believe that the government ought to take more of a responsibility, play a more progressive role in helping the poor. So in Britain, we start to see this happen, especially because liberals realized that if they were going to get the vote from the working people who were becoming more and more enfranchised every few years, they were going to need to appeal to the working class. So in Great Britain, the liberal parties themselves, they start to reform. Mainly these reforms are driven by unions, by the Labor Party. This is the working men's party, the working men and women's political party that stands for better working conditions and living conditions for the factory workers. Some trade unions even began to demand things like collective ownership, which sounds pretty socialist, right? Because they want to collectively own their trades or their factories. We even start to see now in England this political group called the Fabian Socialists. So who were the Fabian Socialists? Well, Fabian Socialists were not actual socialists. They don't really believe in revolution. Remember, socialists, they want to overthrow the ruling class and create a new world order. Well, socialism has really become much more tame. Socialism has now started to work within the political system rather than trying to overthrow it. And so in Britain, we see the Fabian Socialists who they want political activism. They want the government to play a role. They do not want class struggle, like what Karl Marx said. They do not want to overthrow the government. They want the government to start cooperating with them. This really affects Britain's modern day Labour Party, which is supposed to stand more for, the labor class, the working class people. They, again, are not looking to overthrow anything. They just want to improve life for the working class. They want to reform working conditions and living conditions. This is driven by the Prime Minister of Britain at the time. His name is David Lloyd George. He's a pretty important person in British history in the early 20th century. He will also be the Prime Minister during World War One. So he was a liberal, but he abandoned the idea of laissez-faire, because what does laissez-faire do anyway? It creates a system of competition, which creates winners and losers, essentially, like what Marx had said, and it really helps to kind of drive poverty. So it doesn't really do, the laissez-faire insists that the government not get involved in the economy, not even to instill progressive ideas that could help the poor and the working class. So David Lloyd George, he starts to back all of these social reform measures. He supports them. This turns a lot of people, a lot of wealthy upper class people against him. So he was not popular amongst the upper class of Britain, but the people, the working class people, liked him. He starts to implement some laws that are supposed to help us, like the National Insurance Act in 1911, that would give people things like health care or retirement pensions. This is actually the beginning of what would become the British welfare state. And when I say welfare, that doesn't mean like what we think of as welfare, which is where a person is unemployed and they just get a check from the government. That's not what we mean. A welfare state is really a state in which the government plays an active role in establishing the well-being of the people, usually via finances. But there is a lot of conflict in England as well. The Irish problem of home rule, the conflict around that has not gone away. Ireland desperately wants to rule itself. They want to free themselves from the rule of the English crown, particularly because, don't forget, Ireland is Catholic. Britain is not Catholic. This is seen as a way to control Ireland politically, not to mention the fact that there's a lot of discrimination against the Irish, a lot of actual what we could even call racism against the Irish by British government. So this still continues to create a lot of conflict, and David Lloyd George is forced to deal with that. This will be resolved later once the Irish actually fight for their freedom in the Rising of 1917. We'll get to that a little bit later. In Italy, liberalism transforms, but in a very different way. If you know anything about Italian politics, you know it's pretty corrupt, and this is really when it starts. Things start to change in Italy because of something called the Transformissimo. Transformissimo. It basically means a transformation. It's cold out here, you guys. But this is where I have to come to get away from everyone. So this is where, in Italy, we start to see, for example, the new government's new liberal government. They kind of transform, but they start to use bribery as a way to get things done in Italy. And as a result, Italy's liberal government becomes really associated with corruption and bribery. But the truth is, if you really want to know, in Italy, whether it's conservative or liberal, it's pretty corrupt. Here's a picture of David Lloyd George. He's the guy on the left with the mustache, with his top hat. And the guy walking next to him, that's Winston Churchill, who was much more conservative at the time. But two of them would become incredibly important prime ministers in England's history. Okay, now let's move on to France. This is the big story, you guys. In France, France is a brand new baby, newborn Third Republic. It's very fragile. And don't forget, it wasn't ever even supposed to be permanent. The Third Republic was sort of created by accident. It was meant to be temporary. So it's very fragile. And it wouldn't take much to rock the boat in France. So when a scandal completely tears the country apart and the government, and it causes people to really lose faith in their government, the Third Republic nearly fell to pieces. This is because of an event called the Dreyfus Affair. And it was an event, a scandal of anti-Semitic nature. So what happened? Well, Alfred Dreyfus was an officer in the French military. And he was essentially accused of a crime that he did not commit. I'll go into the details in just a sec here. But overall, what I want you guys to know about the Dreyfus Affair is that the corruption and the dishonesty, the lies about the Dreyfus Affair were so blatant. It was so obviously a case of anti Semitism just for the sake of anti Semitism that many people were outraged. And the French government and military lost the trust of the people to quite an extent. It had such an impact, not only at home, but also abroad, as people realized that anti Semitism was such a powerful force in European politics. You know, to say the least, we're going to see how far exactly that force will go, especially once we get to the world wars. This also leads to a radicalizing of the French government as the government, goes into defensive mode and begins to purge itself of what it views as enemies. It almost seems to be there seems to be an element of that reign of terror that comes back, not with guillotines or anything like that, but that same idea of like pointing fingers and blame and people being labeled as enemies of the government and that sort of thing. It also ends up leading to the complete separation of church and state in France by 1905, as people realized that religion was, well, I don't know the right word for this, but let's just say some people felt it was toxic to the government and they wanted to see it as completely removed. Many people viewed religion as one of the reasons why anti Semitism was still such a powerful force in French government affairs. Um, so they eventually do get over this crisis, but uh, it leaves quite a scar, especially amongst the working class. So let me go over what the Dreyfus Affair was. Okay, essentially, it's one of the most divisive events in French history ever since the Paris Commune. Alfred Dreyfus, he's a Jewish captain in the French army, and he was accused of selling secrets to the German army. Considering the fact that Germany and France were sworn enemies at this time, this was a huge deal. And this would become one of the biggest political scandals of all time. Dreyfus was found guilty in a court of law, and he was sent to prison on an island off the coast of South America called Devil's Island. Just look at the name of that, and it's probably not a very pretty place to be. Here he is, Alfred Dreyfus. This is, of course, from his mugshot picture, and still in what remains of his military uniform at the time. This was when he was publicly degraded, when he was accused of selling secrets. They stripped him of his medals. They broke his sword. This was done in public, of course, to humiliate him. This is actually the prison where he was for 5 years, all by himself in isolation. Okay, well, what about this Dreyfus Affair? First of all, the evidence against him was completely weak, if even existent at all. And then on top of that, after Dreyfus was sent away to Devil's Island, the secrets continued to be leaked to the Germans. So that proved that it couldn't have possibly been him, or at least not him by himself, because obviously somebody was still doing this after he was already gone. After an investigation, it turns out that a lot of the evidence had been faked or forged, especially in documents. And later investigation turned up that this was clearly a military cover-up, that the military knew that Dreyfus was completely innocent, but they had him accused or framed, and then they covered it up. And the reason why was simply because he was Jewish. This was blatant anti-Semitism for the sake of anti-Semitism. And it also showed people that really the security, the national security of the military and its secrets were of no real importance if what they were really focused on was punishing an innocent Jewish man for no particular reason. It was so bad that Émile Zola, you remember we talked about him, he was the French realist novelist that often wrote some depressing things, but he publishes a really harsh letter in the French newspaper. And it's got this massive title, headline is called J'accuse, which means, of course, I accuse in the French language. And this whole essay, you can actually read it. It's very fiery. He is angry, and you can tell from the letter. He accuses the French army personnel and government of corruption. And he names names. He particularly specifically names French officers and politicians whom he personally believes, based on evidence, are personally responsible for the corruption, the lies, and the charge of an innocent man. By publishing this, he actually puts himself at risk because there's no freedom of the press in France at this time. So he's actually charged with libel. And he has to flee to England to save himself from imprisonment. But this letter was fiery, let me tell you. This is actually what the actual newspaper looked like when he publishes it. And he publishes this letter specifically to the president of the French Republic by Emile Zola. So he even puts his name on there and everything. He doesn't hide at all. Um, as a result of the letter, uh, eventually the real guilty parties were discovered. But get this, guys, the real guilty people were acquitted of all charges. They weren't ever even charged with a crime. Can you believe that? This is why this is so scandalous, and people really were so angry in France. And even then, they still didn't liberate Alfred Dreyfus from prison. So he just is sitting in that prison for a while, even after everybody knows he's now innocent and it's no secret. So this causes a massive political backlash. Liberals, radicals, socialists, they decide that they're going to ally together against the conservative forces, which were the military, the church, and all the conservative politicians, who they saw as being the ones who were implicating Dreyfus. They were the ones who were responsible for the cover up. After all, the military and the church are, traditionally conservative institutions. Now, did all the liberals and radicals and socialists really care that much specifically about Alfred Dreyfus as an individual? No, probably not. But they see this as a political opportunity. This can be used as some sort of political tool to gain an upper hand. So, as a result of the scandal, Dreyfus finally was released in 1899 from prison after serving 5 years for a crime he and everyone else knew he had not committed. 7 years later, finally, he was fully pardoned in 1906. You would think that Alfred Dreyfus would become a bitter man bent on revenge, but believe it or not, when World War I broke out, he actually enlists once again in the military, and he goes on to serve his country of France in World War I with honors. So I think that says a lot about the kind of man that Alfred Dreyfus was. Here is Emile Zola, of course, spilling the tea, as he's writing his J'accuse letter, or maybe he's just writing one of his realistic novels. But that's what I like to picture him as, sitting at a cluttered desk, letting his genius work away. Okay, so a lot of things are changing in Europe at this time. This causes a lot of growing tensions. And one place where there's a lot of growing tension is in Germany. So Germany's emperor, new Kaiser, is Wilhelm, or William II. Willie, was his nickname by his relatives and cousins. So I'm just going to call him Willie right now. And by this time, Germany, thanks to the work of Otto von Bismarck, who was his chancellor, or prime minister, sort of, Germany has now become a military and an industrial power. It's becoming very modernized, but at the same time, sort of torn with the traditions that many German nationalists, of course, were in love with, right? The sort of traditionalism of German culture, along with modernizing the industry and the military. So there are demands for more participation in politics in Germany. And one of the things that becomes really popular there, and this again is because of the work of Bismarck to a large extent, Germany was full of very strong nationalists. Why wouldn't you? I mean, after all, the whole point of state socialism was to create a loyal base. People who were proud of their country, who would put their countries first, so long as their country took care of them. So there's a lot of strong nationalists and right-wing politics, and we're going to start to see how this plays out, especially when... Oh, she's back. What are you going to do, Iris? A little Little TikTok dance? What are we doing?
Nothing.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
They can't actually talk back to you yet. We'll have a Zoom conference pretty soon. Um, this is going to be like on YouTube forever. You really want to make weird faces? Okay. Um, One of the things that happens in Germany, is the Social Democratic Party became really popular. Despite the fact that Bismarck had actually tried to put a stop to him, they grew more popular than they ever had before. Thanks, Iris.
Peace out.
Okay, see ya. I don't know if you guys even were paying attention to me at that point. But by the time we get to 1912, the Social Democratic Party had become really popular. This tells us that German citizens really wanted um, socialist policies in Germany, right? That they expected and demanded that the government look out for them. But there's also quite a bit of nationalism in Germany as well. By the way, Bismarck hated Wilhelm and thought that he was an idiot and couldn't believe that his boss, that this was his boss. Eventually, Bismarck gets fired by Wilhelm, and Bismarck kind of rides off into the sunset. Uh, in Austria-Hungary, we see the same thing. Notice I call it Austria-Hungary, not just Austria anymore. The dual monarchy was created. Last time you and I talked about Austria. So the problem, though, is that every national group in Austria now is seeking its own form of government. So there's a lack of stability. The Austrian government itself had become a total circus as people just yelled at each other in their own national languages and would try to drown each other out with everything from musical instruments to drums to sometimes even just outright fistfights breaking out within the Austrian legislature. So there's a lot of agitation. And now people are also upset with the Hungarians. Because this is now Austria-Hungary, but the Slovakians and the Slovaks and the Croatians and the Bosnians, they don't have theirs. And it turns out that the Hungarians, or the Magyars as they were called, were actually sometimes just as oppressive. So you start to see, like, for example, Tisza, who is the Hungarian leader, and Emperor Francis Joseph. They are seen as basically being very oppressive to the other nationalities. The Croatians and the Bosnians, they're not happy with the fact that the Hungarians get their freedom and then they happily oppress everyone else. They're sort of seen as backstabbers in that sense. So that being said, as we're going into Eastern Europe, we start to see the problems of nationalism and industrialism. And in Russia, things are starting to change. One of the things that the wind's picking up. One of the things that happens in Russia is a push to industrialize. Remember, the Crimean War had exposed how industrially backwards Russia was. And some leaders in Russia now want to try to finally tackle this problem. What are we going to do about it? At the same time, can you industrialize a country while avoiding all the side effects of industrialism, like Marxism? Because remember, if you're going to bring in industry, that's going to bring in an industrial working class, factory workers who are often poor, and they veer towards ideas like Marxist socialism and communism. That's not good because Russia's already a poor country. It's fairly backwards and oppressive in that sense. So, bringing in industrialism is going to pose some problems. So Russia's really stuck between a rock and a hard place here. There are of course like a working class that is starting to grow, and of course with that we start to see some socialist parties because the two kind of go hand in hand at this point: socialism with industrialism. Well, it also doesn't help that there's also a new czar in Russia, Nicholas II. He is also the last czar Russia will ever have. Nicholas II was he is the son of Alex III. And remember, Alex III he basically rules with an iron fist. He had been the one that was resentful of the Russian people for assassinating his father. Remember, Alex III's father, Alex II, had freed the serfs and then was blown up with a bomb for it. So Alex III rules with an iron fist. Nicholas II, not so much. He's seen as sort of a marshmallow of a guy. and people don't really have faith in his leadership abilities. He's sort of kind of like Louis the 16th in that sense. Like, he just doesn't really have what it takes to be a Russian czar at this time. He wavers between trying to be nice and trying to be liked, and at the same time crushing any sort of opposition. He doesn't quite know how to make Russia thrive in this new era of industrialism and imperialism. So a couple of things make him really unpopular. This will lead to a revolution in 1905. This is not the Russian Revolution, not the one that will lead to communism and the creation of the Soviet Union. This is sort of a precursor, sort of mini revolution in 1905. What causes this revolution? Well, first, Russia was humiliated in the Russo Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Think about that for a second. Russia is humongous and is considered to be, a European. So, therefore, at least the government, is seen as this sort of like European power, even though Russia is huge and is very ethnically diverse. Japan is a small island nation and had fairly recently industrialized. Here's the difference. Russia industrially was sort of backwards, right? They had not industrialized, and they proved that in the Crimean War. Japan, on the other hand, had been forced to industrialize incredibly rapidly when the United States forced it to open up or be taken over by like China was. Japan's motto here is, if you can't beat them, join them. So as a result, Japan becomes an industrial power, and they go to war over Korea. So both Japan and Russia want Korea because it contains ice-free trading ports, which Russia desperately wants. Japan, however, views Korea as its rightful territory. So they go to war over Korea, and Japan wins. And for a small, non-white, non-European nation to defeat massive Russia, this was seen as humiliating. Once again, it exposes how backwards industrially and how behind Russia was in industrialization. One of the things that really works against Russia is the fact that the war was mostly fought in Korea. Well, to get Russian soldiers to Korea, or at least to near Korea, Russian soldiers had to take a train all the way across the massive country that is Russia. The only problem is the train tracks actually were not really completed. So, not only to get soldiers there, but to get supplies like bullets there. To get a single bullet to Korea, where the Russian soldiers were fighting, or to Port Arthur in China, you had to put the bullet on a train. Okay, you had to ship the bullets on a train. But somewhere the railroad tracks ended and they were not yet finished building them. From there, they would have to offload the bullets, put them on dog sleds. Dogs would then pull them across some rugged terrain until they got to the next set of train tracks, and then they would be loaded again onto trains and then finally get to the soldiers. As you can imagine, Japan didn't have that problem. So it's no wonder, of course, that Japan won. They also had better guns that they had learned to use from the Americans. Well, as a result, and because of this and a few other problems, including the fact that the peasant class was poor, the the factory workers were growing restless in their poverty. People were starving to death in Russia as well. There was a general strike in October of 1905. And the people begin to demand, they want some civil liberties. They want a legislature like all the other countries in Europe have now. Why is Russia the last one to get one of these? Russia is the last country that has an absolutist czar in power. So Nicholas gives in and he decides to give them one. This legislative body is called the Duma, as you guys can see right here, the name of the legislative power, the Duma in 1907. It's supposed to be a legislative house, right? Like they are supposed to work with the Tsar to write laws and stuff like that. But Tsar Nicholas doesn't actually intend to give them any kind of power at all. The Duma is sort of powerless and it falls apart pretty quickly. The Duma meets, but at the end of the day, the Tsar can do whatever he wants, and the Duma goes largely ignored. So, for that reason, the revolution fails. This is also called sort of like the failure of the October Manifesto, right? The October Manifesto, October 1905, as you see here, is when the Tsar had given the people, the Duma, and essentially it didn't really do anything at all. It was just lip service. Here is Nicholas II, by the way. You guys will notice he is here with his wife, Alexandra. Alexandra is the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. That makes her first cousins with William, who is the Kaiser of Germany, and she's also the first cousin of King George of England. So the leaders of Germany, England, and Russia are all related. They're all cousins. By the way, Alexandra and Nicholas were one of those rare royal couples who were actually genuinely in love with each other. They were known to be happily married. They had quite a few children, 4 daughters and 1 son. I'm going to talk about them a little bit more later once we get to the Russian Revolution. Okay. All right, and then finally, I'm just going to briefly talk about the United States. Around the same time, the United States is really making a name for itself. It's becoming powerful. It has become industrialized, perhaps even more industrialized at this point than Germany, certainly more industrialized than Britain. And the labor class, of course, is also rising up and making demands for improvements. They go through many of the same growing pains, calls for better working conditions and living conditions that Europe does, especially as people move into the cities through urbanization. There's a massive influx of immigrants from Europe at this time. We start to see, for example, people move into the cities more so. By 1900, 40% of Americans live in major cities as opposed to only 20% who had lived in cities prior to the Civil War. So this gives way to what is called the Progressive Era, where Americans then start to make demands for for the government to actually get involved and make improvements in people's lives and actually take care of the general welfare of the population and the working class. Under President Wilson, he will implement things like income tax, which is going to make people pay taxes based on what they make. He implements the Federal Reserve System, which you've probably heard that in the news lately, as the Federal Reserve System is responsible for, moderating the economy. Recently, you probably just heard last week that they slashed interest rates to zero to try to stimulate the economy. And of course, at the same time, Canada is also growing, but it is part of the British Commonwealth. I'm not going to get too much into Canada because it's not something that we really need to concern ourselves with the AP exam. But if you want to know more about it, of course, you can look it up. So anyway, I'm going to now. Whoops, go away. I am now going to stop this. Whoops, I'm going to put a stop to this recording. I want you guys to ask me any questions that you have. We have our first Google Chrome. We have our first meeting, or what's it called? Zoom. That's it. We have our first Zoom meeting tomorrow if anybody actually wants to come in and say hi. So I hope that you have found this lecture helpful. I'm going to try to put one more up on imperialism, and then I'm going to start putting up some World War I, World War II stuff as well. You'll have to excuse my fumbling around with technology and the fact that I'm freezing and working from home and kids, my dog, you know. Anyway, maybe tomorrow I'll be able to talk to you guys from inside my house. It's so cold out here. Anyway, you guys keep up your work. Don't forget that you can use the website as well. So don't forget, if you go into my Chapter 24 website, there's all these resources and videos. There's a video here on the Dreyfus Affair that I highly recommend. There's videos on imperialism, nationalism. So just kind of keep using the resources that I have already put up here for you. That's what they're there for. Okay, guys. So anyway, I really miss you guys. I hope you're all doing well and dealing with this quarantine as best you can. I'll try to get better at this too. I know I'm not really good at it. Anyway, guys, I hope to see you guys again very, very soon. Seniors, I hope that we're back and that graduation isn't canceled. All right, I will talk to you guys later.